This
Daniel.
conference will now be recorded.
I'm Daniel Izquierdo, and I think I know everyone in the call as well. So yeah, CEO of Bitergia and co-founder.
So this all started for quite a while. Like we've kind of been looking at this, or on my end, on the Pronovix end, we've been looking at it like how could we, with developer portals, how could we do something meaningful in the inner sourcing space? This has been something that we've been looking at for several years. I think this is where my relationship with Daniel and Bitergia really got started, or where it really developed. Like we knew each other a bit earlier, but I think that's where it really evolved, right, Daniel?
Yeah, probably the very first time we really started discussing together and so on was in Stuttgart during the Innersource Common Summit. That I think it was in spring 2018.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Because we were looking at, like, we were back then already specialized in developer portals, and we were looking at like how can we do something with developer portals for the inner sourcing space. The thing was that in the inner sourcing space, there was not, it felt like there was not enough free value. So there was value in doing it, but it wasn't like people were like coming running down the door or something like that. It's like, hey, yes, we want the developer portal. It was more like a, oh yes, we would like to have a free developer. Tell us when it's done, kind of thing. And yeah, that doesn't work in a commercial model. So very short developer portals. Like I think most of you know, but we come from the API space, where developer portals are kind of like a self-service hub for APIs. But they're also like an interface for the initiative, like where you can communicate with the people that are using your APIs, and you can put information about what you're doing and not make announcements and stuff like that. But it's, yeah, in very short, as a summary for us, developer portals are kind of like this place where all these different communication threads come together. Now, one of the big things that I think is coming and should be coming is that developer portals become kind of like this nexus for not just APIs, but also software projects, like inner sourcing projects, but maybe also open source projects, and that they can become like a central hub where all of these things come together. And that's why we're interested in it, and that's the angle from which we're kind of like looking at this. Can we find people that are interested in that? So far, I've had conversations like this with organizations that are interested, but still the API angle is the dominant one so far. But I think that there's an opportunity to go beyond that. And then a couple of, is it weeks, Daniel, or it's longer?
Yeah, probably it's longer.
It's longer. That we started. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's on top of what you've mentioned, right? So specifically at the Innersource Commons and around all of the community of Innersource practitioners and everything. So we see that developer portals is something that is interesting for them. Metrics to measure, to create awareness, to understand where they are, to put metrics in action is one of those places that people are interested as well. And even when you have both talks or different talks at the same time or split during the Innersource Commons, there is definitely great discussion, good questions, and the feeling in general is that there is interest, right? So both point of view is about helping management and developers to be more efficient, to improve their work, basically reduce complexity of their daily work. And in the case of Bitergia, with that respect, we have the product, right, with Bitergia Analytics that is based on Grimoire Lab, which is an open source project. And our feeling again is like the specific product of developer portals is really interesting. The specific product of inner source metrics or open source metrics, depending on who we talk to, is interesting. But we believe that there is an intersection between both worlds, because basically some of the pain points that we can talk to if we think about inner source is about discoverability and findability of the projects, where basically developer portals can help. But then at the same time, understand how your inner source journey is evolving, right? So then for this, you need something, basically some objective measures of how the journey is going. So then for this, you need metrics, inner source metrics, open source metrics. So this is the context, or the, let's say, what we are trying to explore today.
So basically, it's this idea of like one thing that's quite big in the, especially in the API scene, but I think this is also now becoming more important in the in the security crowds, like especially after things like Log4j, is observability. Do you know what's going on inside of your organization? In the API space, that gets translated into, rogue APIs that are being built, that are maybe even being exposed, where you're making your organization vulnerable to attack because it's not properly managed. I think in the software, in the open source segment, this is then upstream dependencies that are being used that are not clearly known, or that might be completely unknown. Like Log4j was surprising for a lot of organizations into like how far it stretched and where it was all visible, and basically creating observability in the organization about the software landscape, both of the services and the code artifacts that you're using to create your services in your organization. And then I think connected to that is maybe also metrics delivery. It's like, can we deliver metrics inside of the organization into their own context, so that potentially developer portals can become a delivery platform for metrics. And this, and then that connected with, okay, so well, the things that Daniel is gonna explain in a moment. Daniel.
Yeah. So part of the discussion we had, and please drop your questions in the chat and so on, so we can have later an open discussion. So if we think about the technological stack of large corporations, how they are using software, basically they can either develop things from scratch internally. They can outsource the development to maybe another companies or so, or maybe they can use existing technology in the market, like maybe open source or maybe proprietary software. What happens nowadays is that a big percentage of all of this software, either you are developing internally and you are using some open source libraries, maybe because you are buying a specifically outsourced development, but they are using certain open source pieces of software, and perhaps because you are directly using existing software in the market, a big percentage of all of this is open source. And there are, well, basically there are some numbers out there where all of them are marking over 70%, 80% of, in some cases, that they are using and adopting open source technology. So there is definitely a need to understand the technology that we are adopting, because most of this technology is open source. So from a large corporation perspective, if you are having a specific provider, that provider specifically follows certain risk assessment, whatever it is, maybe from a legal perspective, financial perspective, and others. So what happens specifically with open source? Because open source, and this is basically what we claim here, is that should be seen probably as another provider. And in the same way that you take care of this provider that is around you, your satellites in somehow, you should take care of open source as extra provider. It doesn't matter if there is a company behind this providing you commercial support, or maybe this is an existing library that you are using because this is good for your specific purposes. So you can go ahead, please. So if we think about how open source is adopted in large corporations, unless you have a really strict process and really, narrow or platform laptops or so, basically this is as fast as You go somewhere because you know some open source project that is cool or is providing the specific functionality or technology that you have. You clone the repository and then you are integrating that with your things. So if we ignore for a moment problems related to code scanning, security issues, or open source licenses compliance, the next thing is about how sustainable the community is. So you are basically integrating into your technological stack, what we saw before, a piece of open source. So how are you sure that you are mitigating the risk of adopting that technology? So how are you sure that that technology and all of the dependencies, and basically we can go to the specific case of log4shell, that this is not happening. So that's basically the problem we have on the table, right? How can we keep track of this? And the perhaps the idea that I'd like to share today, or would like to share today, is that open source, and specifically open source communities that you are really adopting the technology, should be seen as another provider. So if you are using the software, you should bring back to the community. You should be contributing back in somehow, helping them, understanding the community, either providing resources, time. So it's not everything is about money, right? So you can give them maybe even marketing actions. You can help them by letting the community know that you are using their technology. So then they can grow, they can be more sustainable, right? So at the very end is, what is the risk for adopting those open source technologies, and do you have any contingency plan? So those are perhaps the questions. So next slide. Thank you. Now we have three definitions. Sbomb, which is stands for software bill of materials, and this is in a really short way a list of software components and dependencies. As we saw before, some of them, or depending on the company, most of them are probably open source.
Next.
Yeah. Sustainer, which is a definition coming from the Sustain OSS community. You can have a look at it as sustainoss.org. And the definition that they have, I really like it. That is, the individual or organizations who is concerned with their current state and future of highly used and impactful open source project. So the question here again is, what are your highly used and impactful open source projects? So next slide. And the final one is about community. So what is an open source community? What is a community of practitioners? So basically it's a group of people that are working together with a vision and a common mission to develop a piece of software. And there you can have your competitors, your friends, you can have individuals, you can have people that are there because they have commercial interest. You have basically different point of view, but all of them are having and using the same mission and vision. So these are the three main definitions that I'd like to bring today. So the process, Christoph, we can discuss about this together. But what we see is that there are three main steps that we are trying to bring here as an idea. Let us know what you think. So first one, you are using and adopting open source technologies. So what are those technologies? What is your supply chain, right? And for this, we think that Sbomb might be a good solution for that. So basically, it's about building software bill of materials. That's one of the issues that you may have in your large corporation. Basically, discover everything, right? Then next step is about checking the sustainability of those communities, specifically the open source communities that you are using, in the same way that you have a risk assessment for your perhaps proprietary software providers. You should probably run a similar check for your open source providers, not even the commercial providers, but those communities that you are simply using open source. And then the third step is about making and helping those communities to be more sustainable. That from the large corporation perspective, this is about becoming creating more sustainable ecosystems around the technology that matters to you, the technology and their dependencies. Next slide. Thank you. So now going into detail. Christoph, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I think so one of the things that I'm curious about, because I'm not sure, but I've seen this in the if I'm looking at the Drupal community, because that's where our roots lie. There's certain community or ecosystem shifts that are happening, and there's certain transitions that are happening. And I'm curious if it's possible, like once you're able to analyze your supply chain, like figuring out, because in a lot of organizations, they don't even know what kind of software projects are incorporated in the software deliverables that their teams or their vendors or their partners are delivering to them. But once you know, like, what are those projects that are being used in your software, how could you go and define if something is happening there, if there's maybe a community signal that you can measure for? But before we can do that, we first need to have an idea about like what's inside, what's included. I can imagine, for example, that when you're getting a binary from one of your partners, that you also ask them for a software bill of materials, and that becomes a standard delivery object with every project that's being delivered in an organization, and that is gathered together, possibly in a developer portal, so that organizations can have observability into their supply chain. Then the community metrics. Yes, I was riffing on this already a little bit, but I think there's certain of these things that are just activity related. That's more kind of like, okay, how much commits and stuff like that. But maybe there are certain phase transitions in behavior that are not immediately visible, but that could be derived using certain mathematical models from complexity theory that can help predict, like, okay, something's going on here. This project is no longer sustainable, or there's a lot of activity. Maybe there was a security report. There's a lot more activity happening, or an important key committer has disappeared. Like, this project is now at risk, and like being able to give those kind of signals to an organization, but not just as a like a yearly security review, but more as an integrated part of the software experience in an organization, so that this becomes more of like really a signal that can be acted on and not just reacted on after X amount of months, or after something really bad is happening. Daniel, do you want to?
Yeah. So perhaps one of the open questions that we have, it's this discussion about how to measure sustainable communities, because again, there are specific tools, open source tools, that are dealing with source code scanning and pointing to the smelly places, let's say. Same with in the case of licenses. So then, in terms of community, it's kind of the same. So there are definitely metrics. And specifically, I like to bring the use case of the chaos community, where there is a specific working group focused on risk assessment for open source. And with that perspective, they've been mainly working on dependencies and similar examples around the concept of software bill of materials. So there is a space in here about how to measure the how maintain an open source project is, and basically the idea would be like having like a traffic light saying, okay, we've detected something here. So now we can go and talk to those communities and say, okay, do you need help? Is something that we can do. So it's not only about money at the end. It's about creating the connections and people in the same way that the corporation is creating the connections with other people in other small corporations or large corporations that are providing certain services. So it's about understanding their needs and how how we can all better, work together. So then we can advance, because that specific piece of software is critical to us. So with that in mind, if there is a critical piece of software for you that is specifically open source, the thing is that not everything is about bringing money to the discussion and say, okay, now this is fixed. Not totally. And in the same way that you are, perhaps from an inner source perspective, you are reusing existing software, and maybe that specific development team does not exist anymore, this may happen with open source. So the point with open source is that this is public. So what are your specific plans with that project? Because this may have other users. Are you planning, for instance, to maintain the project because this is important for you? So do you even know how to do this in the open? Do you feel comfortable as a corporation? Do you have the right framework to consume and produce open source software? So there is a really good question by Anna that we can go later in the open discussion. But that's something that we should all be aware. So if you are running an OSPO, if you are having in mind perhaps the security issues around open source, so depending on the department, you may have different ideas about how to approach open source. Definitely, everyone is interested in mitigating the risk in the same way that you are interested in mitigating the risk of using third-party providers. So it doesn't matter if this is open source or proprietary software. It's just that there is an existing risk. So how to deal the best with it? And perhaps this is the key point here is you should have like an active policy, basically helping those open source providers. Doesn't matter if they are commercial or not, but the thing is that at least be aware that you are using that piece of technology, because if there is something that you need to deal with, or you need perhaps to replace the technology because that community decided to move to a proprietary software, we've seen some cases in the past, that's something that is directly affecting your business model. So technology is basically everywhere, specifically software. So you need to think about this.
And I think it's if we want to create more resilient software landscapes, then we need to be able to react, and we need signal, and we need to be able to process the signals that we're seeing, so that we can react and create a more resilient community. Like I've seen this happening in the Drupal community, where like contributor burnout becomes a really big problem, because there's like a shift in how the community collaborates, and and then how do we react to that, and how can we help with that? So this is the part where we have like open questions, and I'm going to I froze my screen with the first question, but I wanna see what's Anna asked. I don't know if there were other questions. Maybe we can start with those.
Shall we open the microphones, or?
Yeah. So everybody feel free to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, Anna, if you want to go ahead and ask the question directly.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Because I had some
Yes.
issues with. Okay,
Works.
awesome.
We can hear you fine.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I write it on the chat that I come from the Tutor group, that it's a group of organizations focusing open source program offices. And when you were doing your presentation, that, by the way, great talk. I think it was very interesting what you were proposing. So in the OSPOverse, there are organizations that are trying to do something similar, or trying to build not a dev portal, but the way they explain it to me is very, very similar. And very focused on more like how to educate developers to contribute to open source projects, and contribute to outbound open source projects. And I asked like if you have considered the idea of building OSPO specific dev portals supported with sustainability open source metrics.
So I would love to, if there is a clear need for it. I think I'm currently so I fully empathize with the hey, this is something that I've had sometimes some like we've been challenging each other on with Danielle, is the because I fully am, like I come from, well, I spent a lot of years in the open source community doing a lot of stuff for the community. And then, but then at some point, I realized that to be able to provide a living for my colleagues, it doesn't always work. Like just purely going on community feeling does not work. You need to somehow turn it into really a commercial thing, because otherwise people are just not going to do things. And you can shame people into acting, but there's only really the biggest players that you can do that. So my feeling is that if we are really going to be successful, we need to make OSPO something that is integrated in the rest of the organization, where OSPO becomes a natural thing, like at least the visibility and what software are we using and how are we contributing, or kind of like that question of like, hey, do you want to contribute? That needs to be something that is pervasive in the whole organization. And so for that reason, I personally, I think the best would be if we would have a single dev portal where we have both our commercial stuff with the upstream stuff, with the APIs, like an all in one place, where when you're using these affordances from your organization to build software, that you're, you have a finger on the pulse and you're seeing like it's alive and it's changing and evolving, and you get that hey, this upstream needs help signal that is integrated into the system. I think that's my personal view, because I'm worried that if we don't integrate it into the full practice, into the daily practice of every developer, that it's going to be, something that's somebody once in a while will go ahead and have a look at, or well, large organizations where there's an OSPO, like where there's an open source office, a program office. It will happen because that's the OSPOS person's job to go and check these things out. But in smaller organizations, this is just not going to happen. And smaller, that's not too much smaller. That's like even fairly large organizations will not do it. So I would like to figure out how can we integrate all of this together so that becomes a single signal. But I don't know if you what do you think about that, Anna?
Yeah, so I was about to say that I totally agree with you, and I think that what you are suggesting it depends on the maturity level of the OSPO itself. Like when OSPOs are just starting, that right now we are seeing a lot of new OSPOs, they might not be prepared to integrate everything. But as far as the OSPO in the organizations start to be more well established and have more years of experience, they have to be more, like have more presence in the whole engineering team. And also it depends on where are they established, rather than the engineering team or the legal team and so on. But I will say that it is more about finding those OSPOs that are mature enough to understand and to be able to say, yes, this dev portal it's needed to be integrated as a whole. And I think that it's a potential solution to some of the questions that I also heard of how do I maintain my developers to keep engaged in open source projects? Because there are companies that says you can contribute to open source only in your spare time. So that is like, okay, that is not actually very integrated in the company. Like I need to do my company task, and then I can be aware of open source and contribute to open source. And there are others that says, yeah, but this is part of your work. You can contribute in your working hours, and they take. I mean, I think those kind of organizations tries to merge everything into one, and those organizations will listen better to the idea that you are suggesting of building a whole developer portal for everything and not only open source. But I don't know if I explain myself correctly.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. I think that ideally, far in the future, I would hope that even if you don't have a dedicated OSPO, you still get the signal that there's a way for organizations, no matter how big or small they are, no matter if they have the money to pay for someone to be fully dedicated to open source, that they can have this signal integrated in their infrastructure. But yeah, it'll take time and efforts to get there. There's also before I move to well, first Anna, this sufficiently answered the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So anybody else had any comments on this question? Daniel, I don't know if you have a take on it. Or...
Basically, I mainly agree with what you both said. So my feeling about OSPOS so far is that they are here to enable other departments in the good use, the consumption and production part of open source, if that happens at any point, and this affects different departments. Specifically, we are talking here about developer portal. So then this means that we are focusing on one of the aspects of OSPOS. And the way, and Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say the how OSPOS are working together with developers is about mainly a cultural approach and maybe process in terms of teaching them how to behave in the open, how to be a good open source citizen, let's say, while the internal engineering practices are defined in any other place, not in OSPO, unless OSPO is kind of adopting the role perhaps of more Innersource and so on. So then we are talking about a different thing, right? But from the purely OSPO perspective, we are talking about consuming and producing open source in a safe way, and then at the same time enabling departments in the use of open source, or at least understanding of open source, how they can make the most of this, and centralizing all of this knowledge in an OSPO. But developer activity specifically is just a fraction of what the OSPO is basically in charge of. So from that perspective, it's probably true that OSPOs so far are not sophisticated enough, or we are not there yet. And then at the same time, I totally agree with you, Christoph, that we need to. So this needs to be part of a larger, understanding of how development is basically run in a company. So it's not that because we are using open source or we are producing open source, we behave in a different way than if we would be doing this internally. So then, but because then basically the process is broken. You are doing different things using different masks wherever you are. I would say the goal of any organization is to have the more homogeneous the development process is, the better, because basically you can move people around. People can move freely to other places. So yeah, summarizing, I agree with what you said, both of you.
Okay, thanks. So the question I have here on the screen, I think, because I paused the screen share, is what I don't know, and I don't know if anybody in the audience knows, is how useful are those signals that we can get from metrics in identifying problems in communities, like and those problems that are going to be detrimental for our usage. Does anybody have experience with that? Like we've been talking about doing a pilot potentially with our product to see, like, what's under the hood. Like I checked with Akos, our security lead, about our ability to do software bill of materials, and he says, like, yeah, it should be okay. So potentially we can do a pilot, but maybe people here already have done experiments with that. Anybody? And then there were crickets.
I'll go ahead because
okay.
I'm one of those that have certain experience with Sbombs. So there is a platform in this case called Cauldron.io. So we integrated specifically one of the formats, SPDX, which is now standard in the industry by the Linux Foundation. So we basically can ingest an Sbomb, and if in the Sbomb, because there are different fields in the Sbomb in the format SPDX, there is the Git repository. So there are other ways of keeping track of all of these, maybe npm package, for instance. But so far, this is only working with certain Git URLs and GitHub organizations and so on. Then we gather all of the development data from that specific open source community. And then at least the first step that we have is we have all of that Sbomb activity process community metrics all in one place. So now how can we put all of these metrics into action, right? So that's basically the next question. So how can we make sense of all of this information that we have, and basically bring the community signals saying, hey, there's something here that can be improved, at least if compared to the rest of your Sbomb ecosystem. So that's the experience we have so far.
Do you know if anybody's ever done a rate change analysis, like, oh, there was an increase in activity or there was a decrease in activity, and then made conclusions on that? There's a comment in Slack chat, Anna. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, bye, Anna.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you. So the short answer is yes. Not specifically using Sbombs, but creating maturity models or quality models around all of this. So specifically my background comes from academia, so I've been doing research on this for several years. So that's one thing. And then in Bitergia, while we were here, we've created some of them, for instance, the Polaris maturity model, which is part of the Eclipse Foundation some years ago. The problem with those maturity models is that depending on who you are, basically you as a company, you have certain interest in the different things, and then you need to give weights to different areas, maybe community, maybe source code, maybe, I don't know, process. So that depends on where you like to focus on. This is probably like a pre-stage to Sbomb analysis, because what we were doing back in time was about the analysis of the top level projects, and then trying to compare different things, right? In either quality models, open source quality models. There are some in the literature. The thing nowadays with Sbomb is that you can keep track of whatever you have in the dependencies hierarchy, and that's basically the key point here, because we are for sure, we all agree for sure that if we go to Kafka, I know that's a really great community, live people and so on. Drupal community is probably similar. The CNCF ecosystem, those are great people doing great things with massive amount of contributions. But what happens with all of those projects dependencies? So that's the key point here. That's the key point discussion. And specifically going to that problem, we have not reached that level yet.
Okay. Anybody else have experience with this? Oh, I keep.
No, I don't see comments, but please feel free to open your microphone.
If there's nothing, also like if you do have, just jump in later. Also, if you are struggling with your microphone. So next question I had was, like, can we build an API or something so that we can, because I think that's right now metrics are centralized. Like, well, there's Cauldron, and it's like your interface. There's other metrics that are available in the community, but they're kind of like in a centralized place. Is there anybody who's doing like an API for metrics or something like that?
I'm not aware of.
Anybody else? This was probably the question we should have asked Anna. Yeah. Okay. And then the last question is like, yeah, like how do we collaborate together and how do we create a joint effort for all of this? So how do we make a win-win scenario for all the open source players, both the communities, the ecosystem that supports it, companies like Bitergia and Pronovix. Yeah. Are there any other questions from people that are still here?
No, it seems there are not more questions.
No. Then I think we can wrap it up for now.
Yeah, we are 10 minutes to the top of the hour. So yeah, it's been a really great conversation.
Thank you for making this possible, Daniel, and the colleagues for helping setting it up, and then everybody who participated. Yeah, let us know how you're interested. Like, well, if anybody of who's still here wants to just say like, why were you interested in this conversation? Why are you still listening? Why are you still here? Are you trying to do something similar, or yeah, how are you working on this? I know there's some colleagues. There's a chat message.
Yeah, well, I'm Alberto, so nice to meet you, Christoph.
Nice to meet you.
I just wanted to say that I work with Daniel, so that's the reason I'm not saying anything else, anything extra,
okay.
because we work together. So, but anyway, thanks for this interesting talk.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, maybe Christoph, you can share the contact details, and then.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's still paused. There we go. So if there's any further questions, this is where you can reach either of us or both of us, and hope to continue the conversation. And yeah, let us know if you're doing experiments.
It would be great to learn from you.
Then thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you, bye.